This is The Why with Lauren Magarino.
Welcome to The Why, where we deep dive into topics, showcase smart voices, and really give you the chance to form your own opinion. I'm Lauren Magarino. For many, FEMA may be the acronym that they associate with recovery from a natural disaster. But for those that have been directly affected, FEMA is a lifeline. The Federal Emergency Management Agency's roots can be traced back as far as the early 1800s, following the Portsmouth, New Hampshire fire of 1802. The blaze swept through the town and destroyed hundreds of homes. The next year, Congress provided relief to town merchants by suspending bond payments for months. It was the first legislative act of federal disaster relief in U.S. history. And over a century later, in 1979, an official agency was created. That is when President Jimmy Carter signed an executive order merging multiple disaster managing responsibilities into FEMA. It came following a destructive 1964 Alaska earthquake and several destructive Gulf Coast hurricanes in the late 1960s. In 1993, President Clinton elevated FEMA to cabinet-level status. 2002 saw FEMA unification with other agencies under the newly formed Office of Homeland Security following the September 11th attacks of 2001. But one of FEMA's most criticized periods this century came during 2005's Hurricane Katrina, when the New Orleans levees fell under the weight of rain, leaving the city 80% underwater. Before Katrina made landfall, Governor Kathleen Blanco requested federal assistance, but its presence was not felt for days. In a 2006 New York Times interview, DHS Secretary Michael Chertoff called the FEMA response, quote, unacceptable. But recently, a different part of FEMA is under the microscope, specifically funding. In late August, FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell began to sound the alarm on FEMA funding concerns. And here's what she told CBS's Face the Nation on August 20th.
Our estimates do still stay that we may have a depletion of our fund now. It's pushed into the middle of September. And as we get closer to that, I mean, this is a day-by-day monitoring of the situation.
The cash flow concern comes on the heels of disaster after disaster, from Maui to Hurricane Idalia and the Pacific Ocean-fueled Hurricane Hillary, along with major storms in the Midwest and Northeast, leading to the question: when it comes to increased natural disasters, can FEMA's financials weather the storm? Meg Healing gives us a closer look.
Our house is gone. Everything that we'd ever known was gone.
From Hawaii to Vermont.
The water came up from underneath through the floor. It's just a mess.
Catastrophic weather events across the country have been occurring one after another, leaving Americans in desperate need of help.
We got 3 feet of water in the restaurant, 4 in the hotel rooms. I'm right here out front now, and we've got debris everywhere.
And the Federal Emergency Management Agency, better known as FEMA, is racing to respond.
We started with atmospheric rivers in California in January, extreme tornadoes in the spring, to the wildfires, and now we are in peak hurricane season. And we have had an unprecedented number of disaster requests from governors because of the extreme weather that they're experiencing. This is our new normal. This is the operational tempo that we find ourselves in.
Since 1979, FEMA has been coordinating federal relief efforts in disaster zones across the U.S., from tornadoes in the heartland to hurricanes along the Gulf. When these occur, FEMA works to provide folks with necessities like water, food, shelter, and even financial assistance, all of which are critical but costly. But costs are adding up, and FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund for 2023 is rapidly shrinking.
FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund, which as of this morning has a balance of $3.4 billion.
With 4 months still left in the year, that's not a ton of money for any other major disasters that might occur. So as Hurricane Idalia rolled in, FEMA's administrator, Deanne Criswell, announced that she was directing her team to implement what they call immediate needs funding restrictions, which basically prioritizes funds for life-saving measures. These restrictions allow FEMA to temporarily put a hold on funding for long-term recovery projects and hazard mitigation projects in order to focus on what needs attention right this minute.
Any other extreme weather events that may come our way without interruption, while continuing to meet the immediate needs of survivors through the remaining weeks of the fiscal year.
But Crystal warns that more assistance will be needed from Congress.
And I want to stress that while immediate needs funding will ensure we can continue to respond to disasters, it is not a permanent solution. Congress must work with us on the supplemental request that the administration has made on behalf of FEMA.
In early August, the Biden administration issued a request to Congress for an additional $12 billion in order to shore up FEMA's disaster relief fund.
How can we not respond? My God, how can we not respond to these needs? And so I'm confident, even though there's a lot of talk from some of our friends up on the Hill about the cost, we got to do it. This is the United States of America.
It's important to note that this isn't the first time FEMA funds have run so low that immediate needs funding, or INF restrictions, were put in place. According to a 2022 Congressional Research Service report, FEMA implemented INF restrictions after Hurricane Harvey hit Texas in August 2017, as the unobligated balance in the Disaster Relief Fund fell below $2.8 billion, right before Hurricane Irma was set to hit Florida. A few weeks later in October, FEMA lifted the INF restrictions after receiving a $7.4 billion supplemental for the Disaster Relief Fund. For many folks, though, that help can't come soon enough.
I'm waiting for FEMA to get out here to give me, let me know what I can claim or what I can do.
The aid might just take a bit longer. Meg Hilling, Scripps News.
Our thanks to Meg. Again, recently, President Biden asked Congress to approve $16 billion for FEMA's disaster relief fund. Criswell has said the funding would help the agency get through the fiscal year. But we have to note the FEMA funding is part of a larger emergency request totaling over $40 billion. That includes $24 billion in costs related to the war in Ukraine and southern border security. So whether politics along party lines will come into play remains to be seen. Let's get deeper into the topic with the president and CEO of Disaster Recovery Institute International, Chloe Demrovsky. The organization is one of the biggest nonprofits that provides education and leadership for disaster recovery. Thank you for joining us on the Why. And I know you attended a FEMA event this week and can give us some perspective on this, because FEMA says the request for $16 billion is enough, but with our evolving climate, do you think a budget overhaul is going to be needed here? Do we need more?
So with the fiscal year ends September 30th, and as a part of their 2024 appropriation, they should get $20 billion for next year. And so the issue is that the number of disasters has been increasing, and the amount of damage that is being caused is also increasing. So, last year in 2022, there were 18 disasters that were over $1 billion each, for a total of $165 billion. It was 20 the year before for a total of $145 billion. So this is kind of the cadence that we're seeing as far as major disasters. This year already, we've seen 15 disasters that were over $1 billion. That's out of the 65 total, plus 11 more that are under review. And that's sort of before we get this sort of end of the fiscal year wildfires on Maui, and then of course Hurricane Idalia and all of that major damage. So that's why we're seeing this kind of fiscal crisis this year, but certainly with an increase in extreme weather, and then just more and more destruction as it goes through populated areas with a lot of investment. This is why there's a lot more increasing strain on FEMA. There's also increasing expectation about what FEMA will be doing in addition to what the state and local authorities are also doing. So it's a colossal effort, and there is a lot of work to be done.
That's really interesting, because in August, a FEMA official told CNN that FEMA's disaster relief fund is often used to prepare for future disasters. I think a lot of folks think FEMA comes after the fact, and that's where the funding goes. How does this work? Are you aware of the future prep that goes into it?
Yeah, so this is actually a really important part of what FEMA does. FEMA's not the first responder. They're not going to be there until probably 72 hours after a disaster. If they have to wait for a disaster declaration, which they will do now that the funding has been limited until the end of the fiscal year to sort of get through with this and save this funding for emergency situations, that means clearing roads, debris, restoring power, that kind of activity, then they have less funding for this preparation and then for the recovery. FEMA is still responding and spending money on disasters that could have happened even more than a decade ago to help those communities to rebuild, and not just rebuild back to the way that they were, but to build back better. That's the kind of critical, important work that has to be done so that we don't have such extreme amounts of damage, because the hazards are natural. The hurricanes, the fires, the earthquakes, we all know these things appear. These things occur, but the disasters are man-made because of our inability to adequately prepare. That's why so much of FEMA's work, and it is so essential that FEMA spends that time and that effort and that energy on preparedness. We are much better at responding if we work very closely with state and local partners, with the private sector, with the communities, community leaders, and citizens themselves on preparedness. It's everything.
I want to follow up to another thing that you said, which was that the expectation of what FEMA does has shifted a bit, in particular when working with, state and local response teams as well, I believe. What's changed? Is it just more weight is being put on FEMA at this point?
Yeah, so people think about FEMA more, right? They see FEMA there, they see FEMA responding, they see FEMA on TV, and they're kind of expecting that FEMA will be the ones who are kind of going door to door and finding people. But FEMA is really only there at the invitation of the state and local authorities. They're not going to enter a disaster until the governor has requested them to attend, whether it's an emergency declaration or a disaster declaration. That can happen in advance. So that happened with Hurricane Idalia. In advance of it making landfall, Governor DeSantis had already made the request, and Biden had approved it before it even made landfall. And that means that FEMA resources can be geared up and can be brought closer in advance of a disaster, but they're still not going to be there in the immediate aftermath. That's what local police and firefighters and other emergency and first responders are there for. The FEMA resources are really there to back up, bolster, and support the state and local resources. And then, of course, the first responder in any sort of situation is not likely to be a professionally trained first responder. It is likely to be a family member, a neighbor, a friend, a coworker, somebody who is there at the scene. So even if everything works perfectly, even if FEMA really does their job effectively, we all have a stake in this. We as citizens have an obligation to understand what we have to do in order to be prepared in these sorts of situations, and to understand what the threats are. That's how we can all get through this more safely and more effectively together as a nation.
Yeah, well, I know FEMA falls under Homeland Security. Do you think it would be better off at this point as a standalone agency? Why or why not, if you could, in 30 seconds?
Yeah, so FEMA was rolled into the Department of Homeland Security as a part of all of that reshuffling in 9/11. And the reason for that is to get rid of silos that lead to blind spots. So if you have something like the COVID-19 emergency on top of a hurricane season and a response, you have departments that are preparing for public health, the departments that are preparing for the disasters. They need to coordinate, they need to share information, they need to share resources, they need to work together. And so that's why that reorganization happened in the first place. And it is very important to continue to combat silos within bureaucracies.
President and CEO of Disaster Recovery Institute International, Chloe Demrovsky, thank you so much for your expertise and your time to really understand this, as we see, of course, an increase in these disasters and, really communities having to come together, as you mentioned, to handle it, and FEMA's role in all of that. So we appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure. Stay safe, everyone.